So as the ushers are waiting upon you, I wanted to share something with you, something new. But before I show you the something new, I want to talk about the history of it. So back when we were first starting this church, or dreaming about this church, it was just a group of 12, we were getting ready to send out mailings, and we had to have an image for the church. We knew it was going to be called Hope, but it needed an image. And so we were saying things like, well, we want the image to describe something about this church. We want to say that this church is new. We want to say that this church is alive, that this church is contemporary. So we had all these things that we wanted to say about this church and have this logo thing say that, help us say that. And so at the time, one of our core group members was dating a young woman who was a design person, a graphic design person. And so we leveraged that relationship. Thank you, Randy. No, I shouldn't say his name. Well, it was Randy Peterson. Anyway, so it was his girlfriend. And so she created some images for us, and about 5 of them that we could choose from. And so the one that I loved, I want to show you, it'll be up on the screen. This is what I wanted our first logo to look like. And I just thought it really captured it and so forth. And so we voted, and it was 11-1 against. I never get my way in this place. So, but there were other ones, and so the one that folks were most interested in and liked the most was the next one that we'll show you up on the screen. And so that was another one that she had put together. It wasn't quite there, though, and so there were some tweaks made and ultimately landed on the one that became the logo for the church for the first 10 years. So that one up there is what the church looked like. It was fine. I never really liked it all that much. And it only took me 10 years to, no, it was fine. It was great. And it said some of those things that we wanted to say. So that was the image for the first 10 years. And then we moved into this building and felt like we needed to redo that and to change it up a little bit. And so another young woman who is into graphic design came up with this next image for us, and so that was the next one that we had. So that was almost from the time we moved into the building for the next 2 or 3 years. That was the logo for the church. Then we were getting ready to put together the sign for the front of the building. So out on Cooper Road, that sign that you drive up past wasn't there for the first several years. And so as that was in design phase, we needed to change the logo to make it a little bit easier for the sign, frankly. And so it was really just kind of tweaking that one, and it became the next one that you'll see, and that's the one that has been for about the last 10 years. So if you have been here for 10 years or less, that's the only one that you've ever seen. But I wanted you to know that wasn't the first one. But it's been a good one, and for 10 years it has served us well. So we're now in this process again. It's been about 10 years, and we are making some changes, and we're also looking at this new campus in Mount Laurel. So we're looking at everything that we're doing, and including this logo, and thought, maybe it's time to change that. But we wanted to do the same thing. We wanted to say something about who we are. We wanted to say that this place is alive and new, because it's always new, and contemporary. And so we found another young woman who's in graphic design, who was actually raised in this church as a kid. Some of you may remember Michelle Gorton, who's now Michelle Gorton Boss. She's in the graphic design field now and knows this church. So we've been working with her, and she helped design this new one. And so here it is. Here's the image. That's the new Hope logo for the next couple of years. Awesome. Awesome. That's cool. At 9 o'clock, nothing. Like no gas, no boo, nothing. It was... So yeah, we're pretty excited about it. It kind of captures what has been. So the H is the H that we currently have, so we're maintaining that, but just freshening it up a little bit. And here's the thing. For us who are a part of this church, we don't need a logo to tell us what this church is about. We know that this church is about following Christ and about being conformed to his image for the sake of others. We know that it's a live, contemporary, dynamic place, so we don't need a logo to tell us that. This is really for folks who we're hoping to reach, not in Mount Laurel alone, but in Voorhees and in the towns that you're a part of, so that if somebody sees that, it might say, that's interesting. I wonder what kind of church that is. That's the whole idea behind a logo and some of the social media stuff that we're doing. So I ask you to continue to pray for your church as we continue to seek to keep in step with the Spirit and be the people that God calls us to be. Thanks.
Hey, good morning. So I know that that's the intro to the series, but I would really like that every Sunday that I preach. Yeah, I just thought that was cool. Sorry, I'm rearranging here. So we have a lot to talk about, so let me jump right into it. So today we begin this new series called Boldly Go, and let me say up front that yes, it should have a Star Trek theme, but it doesn't, and that was my call. If you ask Pastor Steve, he'll tell you that we should be doing Star Trek videos and Star Trek stuff and Star Trek this and Star Trek that. But he got voted out on that one. Jeff and I said, no, we're not doing that. So anyway, it's a series based on the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Now, the story of Nehemiah takes place around 445 BC, but the story of Nehemiah began decades earlier. All right, around 587 BC, the Babylonians invaded Judah and destroyed Jerusalem. The Babylonians took the Israelites as captives and forced them to resettle in Babylon. And while in the midst of that fighting and those wars, the entire city was put into crumbles, including all the walls and including the temple. There was basically nothing left. And the exiles were, if you read in history, in the other history books of the Old Testament, that's the stories of Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and all those guys. That's all their experience, all right? So after decades and after a new king, some of these exiles were permitted to return to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem would never be the same. The temple would be rebuilt, but it was not maintained, and the religious fervor that the Jews had then did not come back. The Jews living in the area had lost their sense of identity, and they had begun to adopt the religious and cultural practices of the surrounding cultures. So all this is taking place in the context of the book of Nehemiah. The political, social, and spiritual condition of Jerusalem is at an all-time low. Now, the wall surrounding Jerusalem had been in ruins for nearly 100 years, and that may not seem like that big of a deal in the 21st century, but in the first century in a city, this was very important. The lack of a city wall meant that the people were defenseless, and so the Jews that were currently living in Jerusalem were relentlessly oppressed by neighboring cultures. The fallen walls also signaled to them that there was a lack of identity. There's a general apathy from the people about who they are and about their culture. And so, see, before the exile, the Israelites had their own language, they had their own king, they had their own army, and they had their own identity. But now they're left with none of these things. And so today we begin this 6-week series from Nehemiah. I want to challenge you to consider reading the book of Nehemiah, or at least the first 6 chapters over this next couple of weeks. Now, it's a 6-week series, and we're going to really focus on the first 6 chapters, so works out to be a chapter a week. Really not that big of a challenge. I think you could maybe take that on. Even if you haven't read the Bible before, it's a great way to begin. It's a great Old Testament book. What I love about it, what I think Nehemiah is so accessible and an easy read, is that there's no overt miracles in the book of Nehemiah. There's no parting the Red Sea. There's no visit by any angels. And Nehemiah never walks on water. It's just about a guy who had a passion, who worked really hard, who prayed really hard, who encountered a whole lot of criticism, and yet he made these incredibly difficult leadership decisions. He was a regular guy who caught a divine glimpse of what could be and what should be, and then he went after it with his whole heart. So it's a great book. Let me challenge you to read it over these next few weeks. So that's kind of the what of the series. Just a quick why of a series. Why would we do a series on the book of Nehemiah? So we're going to read in just a few minutes that the walls, as I already said, the walls of Jerusalem are down. Jerusalem, in a sense, is broken. Jerusalem's broken. And in a similar way, I think we'd all agree, our world is broken. We see it every day. But sadly, it easily escapes our view. Not that we don't see it, it's just that it's become part of the landscape for us. And so poverty and injustice have easily become part of who we are, and we may at times forget that we should be making a difference. See, our headlines, our world is filled with brokenness. Our headlines are filled with brokenness. I went and just as an example, this morning, first thing I did when I got here is I went on to Google News, and while at Google News, I kind of summarized all of the headlines that you find right up there. And basically, here's what I saw. That there are national and world leaders who are throwing insults at each other via social media. That there's cyber terrorism, that there are hackers, that there's nuclear threat. All of these are Google News buzzwords of the day. And even more so is this, is that racism, violence, and unrest has become part of our culture. Things that were once thought defeated have become mainstream again. It's a broken world, and it's not going to repair itself. And if that's not good enough reason to spend a few weeks looking at the book of Nehemiah, we don't have to look any further than our own lives. See, the broken walls of Jerusalem are not much different than the broken walls of our own lives. And so possibly the walls are down in your marriage. Or maybe the walls have come crashing down around your family. Or maybe at work, the walls are beginning to crumble. And if not you, as you walk every day in the midst of people, you are meeting and engaging with people whose walls are falling around them. Because there's no sense of identity. The enemy is running over, and they are left defenseless. So we're going to jump into the series, and what we're going to do is I'm going to read just the first 3 verses of Nehemiah chapter 1 verses 1 through 3. And as we read those, they'll be up on the screen, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. So again, up on the screen it says this. In late autumn, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was at the fortress of Susa. And if you've never been at Susa in the fall, you have no idea. It's just beautiful. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. Now, what I love about this Nehemiah also, I forgot to mention, is that Nehemiah, this is his recorded journal. And so he's sharing what happened, and it's in the first person. So he says, I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going on in Jerusalem. Now, you see, Nehemiah has never been to Jerusalem himself. He's been in exile and has been in service to the king. And his brother, Hanani, and some others have been to Jerusalem. And he doesn't have Google, so he can't search and find out how are things going. And so he asked these travelers who have been there, what's it like in Jerusalem? And so this next statement, their response to him, There are 5 words there that have stuck with me as I've been preparing this message and thinking about this series over the last couple of months. It says this: they said to me, things are not going well. Those 5 words stood out right away. I circled them in my Bible. Things are not going well. Things are not going well for those who return to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem have been torn down and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Things are not going well. And so Nehemiah's brother and his companions, they tell Nehemiah about Jerusalem. Things are not going well, Nehemiah. See, Nehemiah, you've been living in the king's palace, but there's trouble and there's disgrace in Jerusalem. Things are not going well. And so over these last few months, and more recently as I've been reading Nehemiah, preparing, and as I've watched and read the news, I can't get that phrase out of my head. Things are not going well. Because we have natural disaster, as Steve prayed. We have natural disaster on top of natural disaster. Hurricanes and earthquakes. The common phrase heard on the news is the death toll is rising. This very morning, there are people without power and the basic necessities in Houston, in South Florida, in Puerto Rico, and in Mexico. The needs are still even unknown in some of these areas as rescue is still taking place. Things are not going well. This is the reality of our time. Things are not going well. Last night, Kelly and I were out to dinner with another couple, friends of ours, and they asked us about a mutual couple who are friends of both of ours. And as they asked us how they were doing, and we uncomfortably said, "Oh, you haven't heard, they divorced." Things are not going well in our culture. Marriages are falling apart. Lives are left in ruin. This is, for many people around us, the world they're living in. Now, I don't want to be depressing, but I think I have been. Because I find the book of Nehemiah inspiring. See, it's always during these times when it's not going well, it's at these times when the church responds best. It's not by accident that Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church," and then he said, "And all the powers of hell will not conquer it." Just some examples. In 165 AD, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a devastating epidemic swept through the Roman Empire. City after city was overwhelmed by a plague. The mortality was so high in many cities that Marcus Aurelius spoke of caravans of carts and wagons hauling the dead from the cities. Another historian says that over 5,000 people a day were dying. Now, Rome was completely ill-prepared to help the sick or to deal with the mass death that was occurring in several of their cities. And so the Romans were seeking advice from their priests to determine why the gods of the Roman Empire were angry with them. And the best of the Roman scientists knew of no way to treat the epidemic that was taking place. And so what had become their cultural norm was when an epidemic was identified in one of these cities, those who were healthy would run and leave and evacuate the city to leave the sick and dying to die. And then the city could be repopulated. Things were not going well in Rome. And so in the midst of this culture of hopelessness and fear, the Christians of this time demonstrated how their faith made their lives better. They saw this as an opportunity for the church to give hope through care and service to the sick. You see, they believed in this one simple thought, that God loves humanity. And so in order to love God back, we should love others. And they began to practice that in the midst of these epidemics in concrete ways. The Christians of Rome would help bury not only the dead from their own families, but they would bury all the dead, even those who had no expenses for a proper burial. One historian reported that the Christians in Rome provided food for 1,500 people every day. That's a food pantry, huh, Bernie? That's incredible. 1,500 people a day. And another city reported feeding 3,000 people every day when food was scarce. They also cared for the sick. Simple deeds like washing the sick, providing food and water, and comforting the dying. This simple care greatly reduced mortality. And the Roman Empire took notice. The leadership of Rome noticed that these Christians were through these simple acts of caring for the sick, that they were actually helping the mortality rate. And so then the Roman government decided to copy their behaviors. And so they created programs. And these programs were designed to care for the sick. And know what they discovered? They couldn't duplicate it. And they concluded this is why. The Christians did it out of love. They risked their own lives when other people would flee to care for the sick. And so when things were not going well, and the church does what the church does best, demonstrating that life can be better. Or how about Father Damien? He's up on the screen. Damien was a priest who lived in the late 1800s. During that time period, leprosy was an epidemic spreading throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And so to solve this epidemic of leprosy, anytime someone contracted leprosy, they were then shipped off to the island of Molokai where a leper colony was established. And they were just put onto the beach to do their best to survive until they died. And so it turns out that things were not going well in Molokai. But Father Damien, get this, he went on a short-term mission trip. Be careful. This is what happens on short-term mission trips. He went on a short-term mission trip to Molokai. He saw what was happening, and he never left. Instead, he sent word. He didn't have email. He sent word back and said, I won't be returning home. I'm going to move here permanently. And so for 16 years, Father Damien lived on Molokai. He didn't know the language, so he learned to speak their language. And all the while, he bandaged their wounds. He would embrace the bodies that nobody else would touch. And he preached to hearts that would otherwise have been left alone. He organized a school while he was there, and also several bands and even a choir. And he built homes for those with leprosy so that they could die in dignity. And one person described it this way: Molokai slowly has become a place to live rather than a place to die. Father Damien was not careful, though, about keeping his distance. He did nothing to separate himself from his people. He shared meals with his colony, and he got close, very close. And then one day he stood up to begin his sermon. And he looked out at the crowd of lepers and he said, "We lepers." Because he had found out that the night before, while he was caring for another leper, that some hot boiling water had poured on his feet and he did not feel it. And he knew that he had contracted the same disease. Father Damien had become one of them. And he made a difference on a small island where things were not going well. He eventually died of leprosy and was buried on Molokai, where he cared for people for 16 years. Father Damien demonstrated that life can be better. And so while this message may seem depressing, I think it's incredibly encouraging. Because the church is made for times like this. We are made to engage a world when things are not going well. It's when the church shines brightest. My first year here, 2006, our youth ministry went on a mission trip to Biloxi, Mississippi. We went there because a hurricane had just struck that area. The eye of the hurricane landed in Gulfport and Biloxi and devastated the area. And we went to work in the town of Biloxi, and in that area where we worked was the poorest of the poor. They had no flood insurance, no homeowners insurance. They didn't have anything like that. And so most of the homes where the water had reached to the second level were just pushed aside. They just were just removed. And people couldn't afford to come back and rebuild. And so as we were driving down these deserted streets in this city that had been busy, driving down deserted streets, I was with another aid worker, and he said, every once in a while we'd see a construction site where there were people working on a home, and he said, have you noticed something about all the construction sites? I said, no, what am I supposed to notice? And he said, they're all church construction teams. He said, the church is doing incredible work here in Biloxi. We went to Haiti for our first mission trip in response to the earthquake. And while we were there, the thing that struck me is, there was two things that struck me as really cool. The first is, I got to drive in the back of a pickup truck. And you can't do that around here. And so we just piled people in the back of pickup trucks, and that's how we got places. And we just would pile people. There's like rules didn't apply, and I'm like, this is great. And because we were there doing rescue work, right? And there were buildings in disrepair, and torn down, buildings crumbling. And it was a year later, and streets were just littered with debris. There was just too much to clean up, and in a year they still hadn't done it. And as we drove through these streets with all of us piled into pickup trucks, we would pass other pickup trucks, other churches, and we'd be like, hey, church from Arizona, high five as we go by. It was the church being at its best. When things are not going well, the church gets to shine brightly. So in the midst of our broken walls of our culture, when our country's moral compass seems to be moving further off center, in the midst of our broken walls of marriage and broken walls of family, when things are not going well, that's when the church gets to respond most resoundingly. When things are not going well, we shine bright. And so I want you to hold on to all that. And we're going to look at two other pieces, and then we're going to connect them all together. I promise it's all going to work together, all right? Even if trust me on this. So I want to read one more verse. We're going to jump down in chapter 1. We just read verses 1 through 3. I want to jump down now to, as it says, verse 11 up there. Verse 11, okay? Let's read one more verse. Here it is. In those days, this is Nehemiah writing, he says, I was the king's cupbearer. In those days, I was the king's cupbearer. Now, the Hebrew literally means one who gives something to drink. It's a word used about 11 times in the Old Testament, but it means much more than just being a butler. The cupbearer's duty was to choose and taste the king's wine to make certain that it was not poisoned. But he was much more than a taste tester. He was much more than a wine steward. He had incredible responsibility. The cupbearer was someone who was trusted by the king. The king, there were many enemies of the king, and they would want to poison the king. And the cupbearer's responsibility, a trusted cupbearer, was someone who made sure that this didn't happen. Now, since the cupbearer was also tasting the wine, tasting the food, he wouldn't just make sure that the wine, it doesn't work like it does in TV. It wasn't like somebody went, and they pour the poison into the glass. It didn't happen like that, all right? The reason that the cupbearer was there is the cupbearer would also be responsible to make sure that the food sources were cared for. So the cupbearer will be responsible for where the grain is grown and how the grain is grown and who's responsible for growing the grain and all those things, so that the food presented to the king would be safe for the king's consumption and no one could assassinate the king. So he was a most trusted personal advisor to the king. And so Nehemiah says, in those days, I was the king's cupbearer. Now get this, because of Nehemiah's position as a cupbearer, he experienced a blessed life. He had a meaningful and important position. He was provided and experienced the very best that could be provided for him. And he had this trusted relationship with the most powerful ruler of the day. In those days, I was the king's cupbearer. Now, Nehemiah hears about the condition of Jerusalem. He hears that things are not going well, that the walls have been down for a long time. Now, notice, hundreds of years. That means for hundreds of years, people have been walking past the fallen walls of Jerusalem. People have been living in the midst of the broken city. Even his brother and his companions who traveled back saw it and choose to report about it, but it ends there. But Nehemiah does more than that. Nehemiah hears about the walls. He hears that things are not going well, and he's moved to do something about it. He's the king's cupbearer. He recognizes that I am someone with influence. I have a listening ear. And so Nehemiah decided to act. Things are not going well, and Nehemiah saw that as an opportunity. This may seem obvious, but let me state it anyway. Everybody sees the problem, but only a few of us are moved enough to be the solution. And so we'll see in the next coming weeks, this is a story of courage and hard work. It's really a story about practical leadership 101. And it's filled with plenty of prayer. Nehemiah asks the king for permission and help. Then we'll see that Nehemiah prepares and gathers supplies. And then we'll see that he travels 1,000 miles back to Jerusalem with all of his supplies, with all of the men, with all of the resources needed to make a difference in Jerusalem. When he gets there, he's going to rally the people, and he's going to provide them with incredible leadership. And all the while, he's going to experience incredible opposition. And Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem will rebuild the city walls in 52 days. Not a miracle, just plenty of hard work. And so as we begin this series, I just want to offer a simple challenge for each one of us. I would suggest that as we read these verses in chapter 1, that as we see the problem, that we recognize that you and I are cupbearers. The church, we are the cupbearer. See, we have this special relationship with the king. You and I are sons and daughters of the king. Genesis tells us that we bear the image of God inside of us. We are cupbearers. And so like Nehemiah, as the cupbearer, we have a responsibility to see the problem and to be moved enough to be the solution. We need to be the solution. Now hold on to that, jump into a little story, and then wrap it all up. Have you ever been to a restaurant or gone to see a movie or binge watched a TV show and then said to a friend, "You've got to go try that"? Anybody? Right? Yeah, we do it all the time, right? I binge watch a TV show, I come into the office, I tell everybody here, "You got to watch this. You got to watch." I'm not going to tell you the shows, but you got to watch this, all right? Or we go to a restaurant, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that was the best ever," right? I talked about the fat tomato, or even here, because I think it's incredible, right? It makes a difference, all right? So here's what I think. I think the reason we do that, the reason we tell someone about that experience, is we believe somewhere inside that experience has changed us or made us different, and we think that experience will make a difference in someone else's life as well. That's why we tell them, "You've got to watch this show. You've got to go to this restaurant. You've got to do it." It was great. It just happened the other day. Actually, it was a couple months ago. Early in the summer, I was talking to a friend of mine here at the church, and I was telling her that in the summertime, we have a tradition with our family that we will go to the drive-in movie theater in Vineland. And when we go there, we will pack up, we'll have a great time, we'll get everybody there, and we'll buy food there. It's incredibly expensive, but it's so much fun because I get to tell the kids how, when I was a kid, this is how we went to the movies, you know? And it's not like the digital thing we go see where you sit in a reclining chair and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you're in the back of a car and you're watching it up on this old screen, but it's so much fun. And it's like, what a fun experience. And so our family does this every year. We think it's a fun. So I was telling a friend about it, and I was saying, you've got to go. It's great. You're going to love it. So that was early in the summer. So just last week, I see her, and she says, "Oh, by the way, Rick, on Labor Day weekend, we took the boys to the drive-in movie theater." And know what I did? I went, Really? How was it? Did it change your life? And she went, it was so much fun. It was the greatest thing. And I'm going, yeah, because I gave you that idea. I brought value into your life because of the drive-in movie. It's awesome. All right, let's put all this together. The walls are down. We all know it. Things are not going well. Our world is broken. And for some, the world that we live in is broken. Our families and our marriages and our work lives. And throughout the centuries, when things are not going well, it's the church's responsibility. And the church has demonstrated that we can be bright by our actions. And you and I are cupbearers. We're cupbearers. We have the responsibility to not just see the problem. Lots of people see problems. We're called to be the solution. So I hesitated about using this story because it's a personal story, but yet it's important for me to tell it. Is that I am convinced that Jesus has made all the difference in my life. All the difference. A profound difference. And I would say that it's more than any other decision or event in my life. See, I can't go into the whole story, but it's unlikely someone raised in the environment that I was raised in would have the life that I've been blessed to have. And it's only because of God's blessing through Jesus. See, I have a wife who became my best friend growing up. Before she would date me, I thought I was a prize. It turns out we had to be friends first. And then we fell in love. And now we get to be best friends for life. I had 3 kids who kept me up at night when they were younger, and I really didn't like them too much back then. But now all 3 of them love Jesus and love our family. I was the first and still only member of my family to go to college. And then graduate school. Are you kidding me? Never expected that. And I get to come to work doing something I have loved the whole time I've been doing it for 25 years. Now, I hesitated to tell you all that because I don't want you to think I'm naming my accomplishments. They're not my accomplishments. They're all the blessings that have been bestowed upon me, all because of that decision. Because when I was 16 years old, I decided to trust Jesus to forgive me and to lead my life. And that means that every decision after that was impacted by that decision and informed by that decision. So my life is profoundly better because of Jesus. Profoundly better. Andy Stanley says it this way. It's written in your handout. You can take it home with you this morning. It says in there that following Jesus will make your life better and make you better at life. Now, here's why I tell you that and why I told you the drive-in movie story. If I can be that excited about a drive-in movie theater, and I can be convinced that telling someone else about a drive-in movie theater will have an impact on their life, how much more excited should I be about Jesus? And how much more should I be telling people and demonstrating people what Jesus has done in my life? The drive-in movie theater is only a drive-in movie theater. But what Jesus has done to me and has done through me since I was 16 is incredible. I can't begin to describe it all. I could tell you story after story of how Jesus has worked in my life, all because I decided to just trust him. And so people ask me, are you excited about this Mount Laurel campus? Someone asked me at the golf tournament yesterday, they said, are you nervous? And I lied right to his face. I went, no. I was like, nah, nervous. No, you kidding? Yeah, of course. Are you kidding? This is a big deal. This is a big thing. This is like Nehemiah. Like, you work real hard and you pray even harder. Like that's what it is, and it's great. But here's what's been so good for me already in this experience, is that Just like people walking through the rubble of Jerusalem, they saw the problem and did nothing about it. They kind of allowed it to become part of the landscape of their lives. I forgot that people matter to God. In this way, is that I would go to Panera, and I would go to Panera on Whitehorse Road, I go to Panera on 73. I love Panera. I go in there, free Wi-Fi and coffee. It doesn't get any better than that, you know? And I can just sit there, and the officers will text me and say, where are you? And I'm like, I'm in a meeting. Yeah, it's great, right? Because I'm working, but here's the deal, is that the people around me just became part of the landscape. But then I made a decision. A few months ago, I decided I'm going to go to Panera in Mount Laurel. So I started going to Panera Mount Laurel. So I would drive over there, and I'd drive past schools, and I'd drive past neighborhoods, and I would pray. And that was my only intent, was just to pray for people as I was driving through the towns. But then I started going to the Panera in Mount Laurel, and I started noticing the people. And I started seeing that our world is broken. Not because of them in particular, but just that I noticed the people. And I started thinking, if I'm excited about it, I didn't think about that part, but if I'm excited about a drive-in movie theater, I better be as excited about sharing Jesus with people. And so I started praying. They didn't know I was praying, but I started praying about, God, what conversation am I going to have today? So are you going to introduce me to someone in Panera? And am I going to talk to them? And so these poor people have no idea that I'm like, they're just trying to have their coffee. And so we have this challenge. It's written right here in the series title. It's up on the screen. Boldly go. Boldly go into a broken world. Boldly go where things are not going well. Boldly go where people are living in this broken world. And we are cupbearers. We have experienced the love of God through Jesus, and we are profoundly changed and changing because of that experience. And we believe following Jesus will make a person's life better and make you better at life. And every day we can show people that there's a Jesus that loves them. By the way we live, by the way we care, even by the words we share. And so maybe for you right now, your walls have been torn down. And right now, that's your world. It's crumbling. Family, marriage, work, whatever. I pray that this series, as we see the practical steps Nehemiah takes to rebuild the walls, will be challenges that you can take to rebuild the walls in whatever area of your life is not going well. And for others of us, I pray this series will inspire and motivate and challenge us to see the problem, but more than see a problem, that we'd be moved to be the solution. To see that we are cupbearers and that we can do significant things. That we can change the world. And I know that seems so absurd. Change the world, really? Change the world? But those early Christians during the plagues in Rome had no idea that their impact, just by providing some care to a sick person, would change the environment. Father Damien never expected to live and die a leper on an island of Molokai. He was just going on a short-term mission trip. So maybe we can change our world. Maybe it's a simple conversation with a friend, or coworker, a family member. Maybe it's just demonstrating that Jesus has made an impact on your life, and you believe he can make an impact on someone else's life as well. So as we begin this series, I want to just offer up a prayer for all of us as we spend these next 6 weeks together in Nehemiah. So will you stand with me for closing prayer? So let's pray together. So Jesus, I thank you for your word, and God, I thank you for the story of Nehemiah, and I thank you for the practical insights that we're going to discover over the next 5 weeks to follow. But God, I also pray that you would inspire and challenge and change us because of these stories, and that God, you would work in our lives. God, whether we are experiencing a crumbled life or whether we are seeing the world crumbling around us, God, that we would be inspired and challenged by you. God, that we would recognize that we have been privileged. And the blessing that you have poured out on us is not for us to hold, but God, it's for us to share with others. And so, God, we are cupbearers. We bear the image of Jesus. And so, God, I pray that we would be able to share that and demonstrate that to a broken and dying world. And so, God, I pray all these things in the name of Jesus, and the one who loves us like no other. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Have a great day.